there are three basic frameworks that they're putting in place with this document. By the way, it's going to be rolled out at NCSS in this November with workshops and stuff. So belief, behavior, and belonging is a framework they found useful from the religious studies perspective to simplify all of this complexity from cultural studies, traditions, and so on. Explaining how religious identities shape and are shaped by the beliefs people hold, the behaviors they exhibit, and the ways people experience membership in intersecting communities. Again, this is framed as the student's will, but if you ask me, it's way too abstract, but as a guideline for you putting together a set of lessons that are comprehensive for understanding these things, it's not bad. Identifying how internal diversity is evident in beliefs, behaviors, and experiences. So in other words, not everybody believes the same way, but you can sample these things. You don't have to be able to sort out exactly how every sect works and how it differs, but you can sample to illustrate that yes, these traditions are diverse. Analyzing how beliefs, behaviors, and experiences change over time. This is one element that has been completely missing from the historical approach and the textbook approach. It's just set out there and dropped, and you would imagine that because they were that way 3,000 years ago, they are that way today. And this has been a very, very ossified approach. And it often has omitted things like how did the role of religious scholars change over time, which is something you'll be hearing about a lot here. One example is, I often say that the gold standard for teaching about a world religion in the historical approach, in the textbooks especially, and often in curriculum, is how Western European Christianity is covered. Embedded within European history. It is the gold standard. Why is it? Because it doesn't just lay out the origins and the origin story and the major figures and so on, but it goes into how that tradition changed over time. It goes into the evolution of the church, the role of the clergy, the role of women in the church, the role of women in society with regard to religion. It lays out through, the Reformation what the role of religious scholars, clerics were, and so on, and then it shows what happened, in the Reformation, the Enlightenment, and so on and so forth, okay? By the same token, students who would take the approach that was in the textbooks, still is there, on Judaism, would never learn about the rabbinate. They would never learn about the difference between the synagogue tradition and the rabbinate. They just wouldn't. They wouldn't know what roles rabbis played, what role they played in the appearance of Jewish communities all over the globe, in ancient times all the way up to the present. By the same token, you've heard the word ulama here this week, I'm sure, the religious scholars of Islam, who play a crucial role. But they're not clergy because they're not ordained, because but they're also not part of a centralized religious authority. But they're still being called clergy. But their role and their emergence is the central story of how Islam spread, of how Islam became refined, of that dialogue that Maria Dickey last evening talked about with Christians and Jews and others of other religions in the tradition, how it got combined with Greek rationalism and so on and so on and so forth. Students would read these accounts and would say, oh, well, intellectual tradition, they don't have that. They got Muhammad, they've got the 5 pillars, 4 wives, no pork, no alcohol, we're out of here, right? So it's simply, that just shows you the enormous, travesty of it. The role of Buddhist missionaries would sort of get a cameo appearance in these courses, but not what their significance was and how they differed, and certainly not how they changed over time. So going back to what I had that slide about the standards approach, if you could use the way Western Christianity has been covered, and I do mean Western, because Eastern Orthodox doesn't get half that coverage, or even, none of those, most of those categories are out. It appears at some point at the end of Rome, and then, it's Russian, and that's it. So if you apply this, like if it's in the tradition, it should be covered in some way. That would be a way to say, maybe we don't have time to do that, but it's still a model because it's embedded in the history. And it doesn't just go away. It doesn't just, get left behind. And now we're going to talk about political dynasties, in India or China or whatever place it was. So I think it's in that way a really good point here that they're making. So interpreting how beliefs, behaviors, and experiences affect and are affected by other social, political, and cultural forces. This is a really important one because, and particularly using the example of Islam here, the element of Islam and the adjective Islamic is so overdetermined and overused in studying Islam in school settings. It's Islamic art, Islamic trade routes, Islamic pots and pans, Islamic, I mean, everything is attributed to being Muslim. And of course, in the hot news items that come up, anything that happens is, oh, Islam is like that. So what this kind of approach here is to ask students to learn how, using examples, using historical artifacts, using historical, things that they can read, primary sources, how religion doesn't determine everything in a society. And even where it does have a core expression, in other words, people express their problems with politics and society and culture in religious terms, perhaps, that doesn't mean that those other things weren't a major factor. So it's certainly not only confined to the way Islam is covered, but it's really a difficult issue in journalism, in Islamophobia, and all of this, that Islam is really overdetermined as a factor in Muslim societies, where you're kind of blinded to other ones. A really big example of that, of course, is the phenomenon of terrorism and extremism as attributed to Islam. Finally, this beliefs, behavior, belonging approach, giving examples of how behaviors and community experiences shape and are shaped by one another in particular social and historical contexts. This has changed over time, but when you get into looking at the effects of modernity on all the religious traditions, which has often been just plain omitted, this is a really, really useful framework for doing that. And also, one other thing that can be included in this last one is how are religions shaped by their existence in pluralistic societies? So how does religion in America function as religious groups interact with one another, share problems, share religious spaces even sometimes, get tarred with the same brush, for example. But also, there are a lot of interfaith things going on that are shaping the way people believe, how they feel about what they belong to, and their behavior.